Hello and welcome to this talk on the Indo-US Maritime Defense Operational Cooperation. We have with us Captain Dr. Gurpreet Khurana, former Executive Director, NMF and Professor, Naval War College, Goa. After 35 years as a missile warfare specialist and ship's diver, and as commanding officer of two warships, Captain Khurana retired from the Indian Navy in January 2023 and is professor from Naval War College, Goa. In 2001, he was assigned the commissioning command of a fast attack craft based at Port Blair, Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which was extensively deployed in the Andaman Sea for coordinated cooperations with the Indonesian and Thai navies. As research fellow at the IDSA New Delhi, he pioneered the usage of the term Indo-Pacific in current geopolitical discourse through his academic paper published in January 2007. He has formulated seminal doctrinal documents for the Navy, Indian Maritime Doctrine 2009, Handbook on Law of Maritime Operations 2013, and the classified Strategic Maritime Outlook China in 2015. He has authored 3 books and numerous academic papers on geopolitics, maritime strategy, maritime law, and naval operations. As Executive Director of NMF New Delhi, he represented India in IORA, EAS, and CSCAP meetings and contributed to drafting the National Maritime Policy. As member of an international committee of experts, he co-authored the Newport Manual on the Law of Naval Warfare, published in May 2023 by the U.S. Naval War College, Newport, Rhode Island. He undertakes research projects for think tanks and teaches at universities both in India and overseas. Welcome to Christ University, Captain Khurana. Shall we proceed?
Sure.
So, Captain Khurana, what are the real maritime security issues in the Indian Ocean today where India and the US can cooperate?
For looking into this, the first thing that we must consider is what are the interests of the US and India in the Indian Ocean region. For India, the Indian Ocean is really the primary area of maritime interest where its critical interests lie. For the Americans, it's important because of the immense importance of the trade routes, the shipping lanes, and especially the hydrocarbon flows which all flow through the Indian Ocean. Now let us look at this region, the Indian Ocean region, into two separate, distinct parts. First is the Western Indian Ocean, and the second is the Eastern Indian Ocean. Now, in the Western Indian Ocean, India has two very critical interests: energy security and the safety of Indian citizens who are working there. Now, the Americans have no longer have boots on ground in Afghanistan, and Pakistan is not a very reliable partner for the Americans. So the US needs India's support for maritime security in the Western Indian Ocean region, including its contiguous seas like the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. In recent days, we have seen the Houthis, the rebels who are based in Yemen and financed by Iran, how they are targeting the ships. This is a very real challenge, and especially in the light of the announcement of the formulation of the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, which would be in real danger from this kind of an activity. And so this is, of course, futuristic. But even now, as we know, the piracy in the Gulf of Aden and of Somalia, it hasn't yet been eliminated. It is only suppressed. And time and again, these attacks have been occurring even after some pause in 2017. Also, these fishermen who had been undertaking pirate attacks have now evolved into new areas of maritime crime, such as trafficking of drugs, weapons, and humans. And so this is an area which we need to be, we have to cooperate with the Americans in the Western Indian Ocean. As far as the Eastern Indian Ocean is concerned, yes, there is trafficking of drugs. humans and weapons there as well. But the real threat where India and US need to cooperate in terms of maritime security would be to counter China. Uh, we need to we need to respond appropriately to the Chinese maritime militia, which is operating in the Eastern Indian Ocean and even off the Andaman Nicobar Islands in the form of their distant fishing fleet. US and India together, in of course, in conjunction with some other countries like Australia and Indonesia, we need to develop some mechanism of underwater domain awareness so that we can monitor the entry and exit of Chinese vessels, especially the PLA Navy submarines, into the Indian Ocean. So there are actually many specific areas of maritime security cooperation, and if I would uh, like to expand the ambit of maritime security into more holistic sense, we would need to cooperate even on human safety issues like search and rescue and HADR, which is humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. But all this is about India US convergence in having a benign maritime order in the Indian Ocean region. But there is one point which we should not miss, and that is the broader geostrategic rationale. The Americans seek to displace uh, the Chinese growing influence in the Indian Ocean region, and for that they need to do much more to be able to be seen to be having some kind of a intent for providing security in the Indian Ocean region, and that they should not be only focusing in the Western Pacific. So I think that these drivers are very important to formulate sort of a framework of the maritime security cooperation between India and the US.
That's interesting because that leads me to the next question. How can India and the US cooperate to mitigate the tensions that are being caused by the South China Sea disputes?
So in the South China Sea, India has real vital stakes, even though that area comes under the secondary area of India's maritime interest as per India's maritime security strategy of document of 2015. And those vital stakes have to be first recognized and flagged. Trade, seafarers, a major about 14% of the global uh, sh- shipping fleet is manned by Indian seafarers, and all these are plying through the uh, shipping lanes of the South China Sea. And then there's issues of energy security as well, as you uh, would recall our cooperation with Vietnam in terms of the oil and gas exploration. So the there is a convergent objective of India and the US to have a peaceful resolution of the South China Sea disputes so that a benign maritime environment can be developed. And that's how we came to the concept of a rules based, free, and open Indo Pacific, right? Which is important not only for the South China Sea littorals, which is the ASEAN and China, but also for the extra regional stakeholders like India and the US. And therefore, when there is a negotiation to formulate a South China Sea Code of Conduct, the Chinese cannot be insisting on telling the ASEAN that, listen, we will not permit extra regional stakeholders to have to do anything here without a permission. For instance, ASEAN cannot have joint military exercises with India or the US without our permission, joint permission, or they cannot explore for hydrocarbons here. So this is something which is not only illegitimate, but it is also illegal and contrary to the provisions of UNCLOS. Uh, that, then another very important area where the US and India can cooperate is in hardware capacity building and SOT capability enhancement of the ASEAN maritime forces so that they can fend for themselves and see what's happening in the EEZ of Philippines today with the Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia harassing them. So they need to be able to defend themselves, and India is doing a lot, such as in terms of exporting the BrahMos missile, which the Philippines want to use as a buffer against the Chinese if in case it is required. So this is one is the issue of capacity building and capability enhancement, and under the Quad umbrella, India and the US can do a lot. Uh, and it will also dispel the notion that Quad is not inclusive. For instance, you have the Quad's Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative, IPMDA. This is not exclusive. It seeks to include the countries of ASEAN to be able to give them a surface picture of the maritime domain so that they can cater for threats, which presently, of course, it is focused on illegal fishing and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, but it also has military applications, which will be very valuable to the ASEAN countries. But of course, having said that, I do not think that India would agree to be a part of the U.S. freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. Even though there is a great rationale for the Americans to do that to prevent China to establish legal precedents in the South China Sea.
Could you shed some light on India US naval cooperation in terms of the trends, including in the Quad partnership, and where is it headed?
This is a great question because this is something which is increasingly coming into focus and all over the world, and not only in the Indo-Pacific region. So the trends are best exemplified by the trajectory of the bilateral naval exercise between India and the US, which is Malabar. It began on a very small scale. After the Cold War ended in 1992, it started, and it was even interrupted in the late 1990s because of India's nuclear tests. But now it has grown to such proportions in terms of the area of conduct of the exercise, as well as the complexity of the exercise, and also the fact that in 2015 the bilateral exercise became trilateral because Japan joined it, and now in 2020 21 even Australia has joined it. So with US, India, Japan, and Australia all joining in the Malabar naval exercise, it has effectively become a Quad exercise. And no wonder, it's no surprise that the Chinese watch it very carefully. So this is one part. The Quad itself is a matter of anxiety for the for the Chinese. And remember, the Chinese referred to the Quad when it was first instituted, in fact, revived in 2017 November as an Asian NATO, quote unquote. And I already talked about the IPMDA initiative. That is a Quad initiative. So even if the Quad does not seek to focus on hard military issues, military to military cooperation will very much remain a part of the Quad. Notwithstanding the fact that there is now an AUKUS, which India is not included. So the territory is really very impressive, and you have seen the kind of technological help in capacity building of Indian Navy, in fact, Indian Armed Forces that the US has been providing in terms of bolstering India's naval capability for anti-submarine warfare in the form of P-8I Poseidon aircraft, very capable aircraft, the Sea Guardian drones, the MH-60R anti-submarine warfare helicopter, and so on and so forth. So I think this is something which is greater. The last point that I want to make is India has signed so many foundational agreements, the four essential foundational agreements with the US, the last one being the LEMOA, which is essentially a logistic agreement which will enable India and the US forces to use the facilities of each other's ports and bases and maritime and even air infrastructure. So this is very important for India because India would be able to use even Diego Garcia and other bases of the US, as well as it will be a reciprocal arrangement. And the SISMA is something which has actually helped the US to help India's Navy to build capacity. So these foundational agreements are another, I would say, a standard or an indicator of the increasing India-US naval cooperation. Although I must add it with a caveat that India would like to avoid formal military alliance with the US for well-known reasons, right?
Very interesting this. Based on functional reasons, then, would India prefer the US as a maritime security partner in the Indo Pacific or the European countries? And if so, why?
This is a very great question because we in the when I was in the Navy before I retired, there was always a dilemma for us. The American the area of responsibility of the US Indo-PACOM, which is the Indo-Pacific Command, Combatant Command, it goes from the comes uh, west from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean, but it stops at India-Pakistan border, which means it doesn't cover the Western Indian Ocean. And therefore, to cooperate with the Americans, we have to go through the US Central Command, which is based in Bahrain, which was a major challenge, and more so because the Pakistan Navy was involved in the coalition maritime forces operations with the US Navy. So it was a big challenge, and that is the time when we realized will it be better for us to cooperate with the Europeans rather than the Americans, because as I said earlier, India's two very critical interests lie in the Western Indian Ocean, which is energy security and the Indian citizens working in the Gulf countries. But that is now past tense because we have now posted a liaison officer in Bahrain in the Central Command, the US Central Command, and hopefully there may be other issues, teething problems, but hopefully they will be resolved. And now, what do we do with now? How do we compare the European and the that was your question, right? So, in terms of hardware capacity building, I think what the Americans are doing for India, the Europeans will never do, and they're they've got an Indo-Pacific strategy of 2021, which talks about capacity building in terms of legal and procedural issues, in terms of information sharing, training, but not hardware capacity. And it's not only hardware capacity of India. We need hardware capacity building for the entire regional countries of the Indo-Pacific region. The Americans are doing it, but the Europeans will not. And the Europeans have their European Corvette program, petrol Corvette program, and we have had maritime security dialogues, but it's unlikely that they will make India or any other Indo-Pacific country a partner in that program. So that is about hardware capacity, which certainly the US is a preferred partner. But then there are other issues which to my mind, they are challenges. Now, the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy of 2021 and India's IPOI, which is the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, which was launched in 2019. Now, at the face of it, it's all so fine. Both look very similar. Both have seven priority areas, but there are nuanced differences which are functional differences which make a difference. I'll give you two examples. For instance, one is about the fact that freedom of navigation for the Europeans is not part of maritime security, but for us it is. And therefore, if how can we cooperate with the Europeans when they have a different interpretation of UNCLOS with regard to freedom of navigation, and we have a different interpretation in terms of not allowing for instance, foreign activities in the EEZ and asking foreign warships to take inform us in advance before doing that. So these are issues which are real functional issues. And maybe tomorrow the Europeans will tell us, please amend your domestic law and adhere to our interpretation. Then what do we do? The second issue about the difference between IPOI and the European Indo-Pacific strategy is the aspect of illegal fishing. Now, for India, illegal fishing is very much a part of maritime security, and more so now because the Chinese fishing fleet are doing all sorts of intelligence gathering in Indian maritime zones. But for the Europeans, it is not a maritime issue, it's an ocean governance issue. And to make things worse, the Europe is the biggest export destination for Indian fish. So, if Indian fish is not following certain practices which the Europeans want, they'll be banned. They will not take your fish. Therefore, if you want to cooperate on maritime security, you can do that. But they will, the Europeans could put additional pressures upon India that we will not accept your fish. And we have not signed and ratified the PSMA of 2009, which is an international treaty to, against illegal fishing. And we have not done that for good reason, because we are not really prepared yet to do that, because it will take away the livelihood of our fishermen. So these are real issues where there are differences. So coming back, so again, the Americans have a different convergence with us. Their convergence with us is about China. And therefore, the Americans would like to search for answers to respond to China's maritime strategy jointly with the Indians. But the Europeans say that the whatever happens, if there's a war in the Indo-Pacific, it's not of our concern. We have got our own war to fight in Ukraine. So there you are. That is the reason which connects up with the issue of capacity building. The Europeans will not do capacity building for us. They will not help us, or the at least my perception is that the Europeans do not see beyond the horizon, to say. When the Ukraine war started, that is the time. The next day, as soon as the Russians launched the offensive, the German chancellor, he declared a biggest jump in Germany's defense expenditure, which was largest since the end of Cold War. Now, this shows a reactive policy, a knee-jerk policy. And therefore, I say that the Europeans, they do not realize that it takes a long time to develop naval capabilities and interoperability with the regional countries, which they are not realizing now, because maybe for the reason that they are so preoccupied with the Ukraine war. But then there is a growing nexus between China and Russia, which they must foresee and prepare accordingly, which they're not doing. So at the end of it, and for these reasons, I would say I would prefer the US than the Europeans for maritime security cooperation for India.
So you're talking about war, and the world is also talking about war, especially with China stockpiling nuclear weapons and all of that. So that brings me to my next question. In case of a war in the Indo-Pacific involving the US and China, what operational role do you envisage for India and its defense forces?
Yes, I think that's a very valid question, and it is quite often it is ignored because it goes into levels of sensitivities, and we need can be candid out here. And it's very clear, as per India's strategic assessment goes, the next war in the Indo-Pacific region, a major war, I would say, which has got a maritime dimension, it would be over Taiwan. And that is the reason in July of this year, the Chief of Defense Staff had directed the armed forces of India to identify options in case of a war over Taiwan specifically. So, and my sense is that the will certainly be involved, and it will not be like the US involvement in Ukraine. It will be much more direct, and even Japan. both the US and Japan would be belligerents in legal terms. So having said that, and I did allude to this fact earlier, that India would like to avoid any military alliance with the US. This has got the reason is linked to India's historical past and of course its cultural ethos. Uh, but of course, there is a caveat here that India would prefer, but of course there may be a possibility that things may go south and India is forced into a formal alliance with the US. And this has happened before when India did have a formal, if not a military alliance, but a sort of a quasi alliance with the Soviet Union when we were pushed. And Prime Minister Bhutto of Pakistan, he was very, uh, you know, very clearly he said that India between that time between 63 and 65, India was bi-aligned and not non-aligned because India was also seeking help from the US at that time against China. So there has been a precedent, but then since again, I would say that India would avoid going in for because it has tremendous cost for a country like India. So now coming to the main gist of your question, the question is to what will be India's operational role, and I would then, for the reasons that I gave, I would qualify it with Taiwan war. Now, would the question now emerges with will India join the war as a belligerent? And now this will you cannot say it at this sitting here at this time. It will depend upon many factors. For instance, what is the trigger for the war? What are India-China relations at that point in time? What are India's direct interests, especially economic interests at stake as the war progresses? Uh, what is the kind of political diplomatic support that is being given either to China or to US? India will have to weigh many of these issues. And then what is the involvement of the Quad? Uh, what is the level of resistance that the Taiwanese are? Because there's no point in India joining in when even the Taiwanese don't want, for instance. So, so these are many, many issues. But now let's look at an instance where India has not uh, joined the war as a belligerent. In that case, also, I think India will play a crucial role. For instance, at the United Nations. It will support the US for obvious reasons. It will provide refueling and logistic support to the American forces like it has done in the past.
Right.
And now we have the LEMOA, the logistic agreement as well. And there have been some tie-ups with Indian shipyards, including private shipyards, by the Americans that they would repair and the battle damage has to be repaired and that will be done. So there are new things which are coming up, and of course, India would certainly provide covert support, such as in terms of intelligence to the US forces. So these are the things which come to my mind just very clearly, and there could be many more. Now let us take the hypothetical scenario wherein India becomes a belligerent, which means it formally joins the war, which is not impossible. In that case, the Indian Navy will be specifically involved for a blockade of Chinese ships in the Indian Ocean because all China's energy supplies, if not all, 80% of it flow through sea routes and all through the Indian Ocean, even if they have to go through Myanmar. And so, the Indian Navy's clock interdiction strategy would be valuable support for the overall blockade that the US Navy will is almost sure to enforce. Of course, in conjunction with many other kinds of operations. Uh, Now, will India open a second front across the LAC to help the Americans? Or well, that is an interesting question, but then it's the answers are very difficult because, as I said earlier, there'll be many, many, many imponderables which we really cannot factor at this point in time. The combination permutations of that. About the last question, the last part of the question is about how will the US, which is very pertinent, Will the US help India in case of an India-China war, which does not involve Taiwan, friends? Let's forget about West Pacific for the time being. So now again, there is no formal alliance treaty between India and the US, and so the US is more likely to maintain neutrality because I think it's going to be quite a replay of the Ukraine case with some differences. Differences will always be there, but the US has very strong reasons to help India uh, with the same principle of legal principle with which it is helping Ukraine, which is the qualified neutrality. This was not a term of legal language before the Ukraine war started. Either you were neutral or you were a belligerent. Now there is a new term which is qualified neutrality, which means we will not commit ourselves fully and then we will support by selling your adversary by selling arms. And so, and for of course, these are issues of more specifics about the American help to India, which I think you must interview some American rather than me for that.
I'll definitely do that. Thank you so much, Captain Khurana. It was wonderful listening to you.
Thank you.
And for somebody who was not in this discipline, to understand what is being said, I think you made it very lucid for all of us here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.